You're looking at a dead man. That's right. You've never seen a dead man speak, have you? Or you may have seen someone die, perhaps even a dead body at a funeral. But you've never seen someone who was dead. Dead for 4 days, alive, talking, and walking around. Yes, I'm Lazarus, the man Jesus raised from the dead. My sisters Mary and Martha and I occupy a rather prominent place in the gospel story, perhaps even more prominent than you know. I'm not sure exactly how my family and Jesus became so close. We had known Joseph and Mary, and our families had been together for years. I guess we just became close through all that contact. So maybe it was only natural that when Jesus began his public ministry, our home became his home. You know, Jesus never had a home of his own since he left Nazareth. In fact, I remember one time someone wanted to follow him and he said, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." He had no home of his own, but he knew he was always welcome in our home, and he and the disciples spent many nights as our guests. It was a place for Jesus to get away. As more and more people came to know him, it seemed he had little time for himself. Someone was always wanting something. People pressing against him from every side. And when he came to our house, he could relax. A little bit for a while, at least. I wish I could tell you what it was like to be a friend of Jesus. He was an unbelievable person. Oh, I know he was the Messiah, the Son of God, and I guess we all knew that and we believed it. After all, his mother Mary had told us the circumstances of his birth. And we had witnessed him perform many miracles, but I guess we didn't think of him as that way. He was just Jesus, a friend. The best friend anyone could ever have. Whenever he would visit, he would always pitch in and help around the house. Well, he was a carpenter, and if something was broken, he'd fix it. He just did it. We were always fascinated by his interpretations of Scripture. It was as though he could take the most complicated things and make them simple. Things that I could never understand became suddenly so crystal clear. When he came to our house, even with crowds outside sometimes, he brought a peace that I can't explain. Well, I suppose you're eager to hear what happened to me. To tell you the truth, most of what I tell you comes from Mary and Martha, my sisters. They were the ones who later told me all that had happened. The only thing I remember about anything was that I was sick. It started with a fever and I was very weak. I told Mary I was going to go lay down and told her I had a fever. Well, she got a cold compress and placed it on my head. It felt so good. I know that I lay there for several days and the fever would not break. They tell me that I was often delirious. I can remember the looks on their faces and sensing their concerned looks that my condition was serious. I heard them talking about calling for Jesus. I know what they were thinking. We had all seen Jesus cure so many people, so many diseases and illnesses. Surely he would be able to help me. As I said, that's all I remember. For it was shortly after this time that I died. If you asked me even before I died what had happened, I could tell you. Because funerals in that part of the country were almost always alike. Why, some years ago, people would go to all sorts of extremes for funerals. The dead person was anointed with costly spices, and they were often buried with prized possessions. and all sorts of other material goods. Why one family would always try to outdo the other in the extravagant funerals. Then Gamaliel, the great rabbi, came along saying he wanted only the simplest ceremony for his death. And little by little, people began to change, and funerals became more simple. People were dressed in long linen cloths. The Hebrew word for it was translated into traveling dress. Quite appropriate, don't you think? Then the hands and feet of the dead were wrapped. I knew that I would be buried in the family burial plot, which was not too far from where we lived. The hot climate meant that burial often took place the day of the death, the very day the person died, because bodies would begin to decay in the hot sun. So I knew that one day I would be buried that way. Mary and Martha told me exactly what had happened, and I was buried just as I described. What I could not know is what would happen next. Mary and Martha had sent word to Jesus that I was sick, thinking that he would come running, but he didn't. In fact, it was several days before he came. By the time he'd come, I'd been dead for 4 days. Martha said she heard that Jesus was coming and went out to the road to meet him. She feels bad about it now, but at the time she was angry because Jesus had taken so long. She blurted out, "Lord, if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died." After that, they talked, and she went to get Mary, and Mary had told Jesus the same thing. They both said Jesus spent quite a bit of time with them on the road. Well, he never did come up to the house, at least not right away. They told me that Jesus had been quite broken up and wept openly, and that he'd asked to be taken to the tomb. When they got there, I guess he asked for the stone to be rolled away from the entrance of the cave, but they told him not to because the stench of death would be too great. Everyone thought he just wanted to have one last look at his friend, I guess. Then I'm told he looked up to God to pray, and after he prayed, he cried out. Here's where my memory is perfectly fine. I can't tell you what happened while I was sick or during those 4 days after my death, but I can certainly tell you firsthand what was said. It was as if I was in a deep sleep and I heard these words. They sounded far away yet loud. "Lazarus, come out." I opened my eyes. I didn't know where I was. I felt so weak. It was dark, but there was a blazing light at the doorway. I sat up, turned my head, and saw that the light was coming through the entrance of the door. I looked around, saw skeletons lying around me, and realized where I was, a burial tomb. What was I doing here in a burial tomb? And then I started to stand up. I saw that I was wearing these burial cloths and burial bandages. And then it began to dawn on me that I had been sick and I had been buried, but I couldn't understand. Had I been buried alive? Or if I were dead, what was happening now? I couldn't understand anything. I walked to the door of the tomb, and outside, crowds were standing around staring at me. And then I saw him. Jesus was standing with his arms outstretched and smiling. People were gasping. I saw one faint to the ground. But soon others were yelling and screaming, clapping on my hands, praying, dancing. They came up to me, patted me on the back. Others stayed back, just staring, as if they were afraid to get too close. The next thing I knew, they were taking me back to my house, and everyone was talking at once, trying to tell me what had happened, and that I had been dead for no less than 4 days. 4 days, decaying in the tomb, when Jesus, after praying and calling out to me, had raised me from the dead. It all seemed so unbelievable, but then there I was. So who was I to argue? It took me several days to get used to the idea. Mary and Martha told me over and over again what had happened, and I just kept asking them, tell me again. Tell me the story. I couldn't get enough of it. It was so remarkable. It was the most unbelievable miracle I had ever heard of. I wish I could tell you my life was easy after that. It wasn't. The religious leaders were so upset over what had happened and the fact that countless Jews were leaving the synagogues to follow Jesus that they immediately began to plot to kill Jesus. It was no secret to any of us, but that wasn't all. If you read from your gospel story beyond the account of Jesus raising me from the dead, you'll also read that because so many were coming to see me, the evidence of the miracle, the religious leaders even began to plot to kill me. They thought they could get rid of the evidence and get rid of the miracle worker. Everything would be back to normal. Nothing was ever normal again. It was only a short time after that Jesus was arrested. I was there at the foot of his cross when he died. I heard his last words. Nothing you could have done would have gotten me away from Jesus, not after what he did. No threats on my life. Nothing you could keep me from being there for him and doing all that I could. None of us could understand why he had to die. What had he done? Loved people, healed people, listened to people, helped people. Is that cause for death? No, it was pure fear on the part of the religious leaders. Fear that people would follow Jesus rather than them. When Jesus died, all of our worlds seemed to collapse. How often in these days? I wished I had been left to rot in the tomb rather than having him raise me from the dead, just so I could watch him die. But then a couple days later, we began hearing reports from those who had seen Jesus alive. Alive! How could Jesus be alive? Many would not believe, but they had not been there when Jesus raised me to life. Anyone who had been at my tomb would know that if Jesus could raise me after 4 days in the tomb, God would and could raise Jesus from the dead. It was a few days later when we saw him. I've never been so glad to see someone in my life. I wish I could tell you everything was easy after that. It wasn't. It seemed someone was always plotting my death because I'm still the most visible evidence of a man who had power over death. But no matter how difficult life would get, I could go on because, perhaps more than anyone else, I felt the power of Jesus turning life into death, turning death into life.